So here's the 4G and here's the 3.5G black. I think I tested the original Death Adder when it first came out, and I think it might have still had correction built in. From what I remember, it felt similar to the MX518, which also had correction. And similar in that I felt like I couldn't find an ideal sensitivity. I felt like this mouse was significantly more accurate. These two don't have correction, so I wanted to see how the sensors perform. After testing the original Death Adder, I've ignored the successors that have came out because the front right lip here makes the mouse unusable for me. In palm grip, it jabs into my ring finger, and depending on where you put your finger, when you click this button, it can pinch the skin on my finger, or if you try to put your finger kind of over it, then obviously you'll misclick. The shape seems to be made for a particular size of hand only, so basically if your ring finger ends over here, because if not, then you'll either have the same problems I have, or it'll force you to curve your ring finger into a claw grip. And depending on what kind of claw grip you use, the slant of the mouse is actually bad for a claw grip. Like if you use the kind of claw grip where your fingers point inwards, it's okay. But if you use a kind where they curve like this, then they don't touch the mouse very much because of the curvature. And even in palm grip, for this back part of the mouse to fit in your hand ideally, your hand needs to be a specific size, and mine is not. I had a similar problem with the Xi, where it seemed to be specifically designed for a certain hand size and or grip only. I heard the Synapse software driver has really negative impacts on the sensor performance, so I didn't install it. There have been reports of the same thing occurring with the Computer Military and a few other mice. I never installed mouse drivers for this reason. The shape and weight of both mice is really bad for fingertip grip, so these are pretty much only FPS mice. Both coatings are bad for dry hands. The 3.5G coating is a little bit better for sweaty hands than the 4Gs. The 4G is mostly textured plastic, with some rubber at the bottom of the sides, and the 3.5G is fully rubberized. So the 3.5G measured in at around 1795 CPI on the 1800 setting. I heard that the original 3.5G had some jitter issues that were fixed in a later firmware update, and the Black Edition that was released later on comes with the updated firmware, so I ordered the Black Edition. I don't have any jitter in game, but the sensor feels pretty awful. I was using it at its default and native DPI step of 1800 with 6 of 11 windows. So the feeling in game is kind of hard to describe, but it feels kind of like acceleration or lag or something. Like no matter what I put my sensitivity to, it just feels completely off. Nothing hits, nothing registers, can't get headshots. The tracking feels like a slow heavy car. I've heard people say swamp cursor, and I suppose that's a pretty accurate description. The liftoff distance is also really high, around 3.5 millimeters. The build quality is pretty awful as well. The two main buttons feel absolutely horrible. They're stiff and have tons of pre-travel. The side buttons and wheel are okay. It's a pretty decent mouse wheel actually. It's a very heavy mouse. It feels like an awful low quality mouse, both the shell and the sensor. For me, the side button placement forces me to grip the mouse in a certain way because I can't move my thumb too far up. But if your hand fits the mouse perfectly, then I think you'll find that the side buttons are also perfectly placed because you can squeeze them without it affecting your grip on the mouse. I'm pretty astonished at how popular this mouse seems to be. It's one of the worst mice I've ever used. So the 4G measured at around 1740 to 1785 DPI on the 1800 setting, and this mouse is night and day better than the 3.5G in every way, except the middle click is stiffer. The build quality is much better. It's lighter, about 5 to 7 grams, but it's pretty significant difference over the 3.5G, and the liftoff distance is much lower, it's less than 2. And for me, the side buttons are better placed or shaped. You can see that there's more of this curvature on the underneath of these, which kind of extends the buttons further down. So I feel like this one gives me more room to place my thumb as I wish, and thus giving me more leniency in terms of how I want to grip the mouse. But at the same time, I'm still able to click the buttons without releasing my grip on the mouse. The clicks are still a little bit muddy, but in comparison to the 3.5G, it's so much better. As far as the sensor goes, it's in the top 3 that I've ever used, along with the MLT04 and the Final Mouse sensor. Even on the desktop at 1800 CPI and 6 of 11 windows, usually a mouse would feel way too fast to control, but this one feels more controllable than usual. It feels very similar to what I remember the Copperhead feeling like, except it has a much higher malfunction speed. For the sensor performance, there's a slight bit of something. The Copperhead had this unique characteristic where USB Deagle and AUG felt really good, but rifles felt a bit off, and this mouse feels pretty similar. I started off one-clicking everyone with USB, but then struggling with rifles. I was able to mostly get used to it, but I'd still pick this mouse over it. It's hard to tell exactly what causes it, as it's fairly minor. It might be some kind of small delay. This graph here might be showing what I'm feeling in game. So some people were reporting that this mouse has horrible smoothing. Some say it's only due to installing the drivers, and some say that it's with or without the drivers. I didn't install the drivers, and I definitely don't have any kind of horrible smoothing. So either a firmware update fixed it, or maybe there's a conflict on some people's computers, or maybe there's even some variance between mice. I've noticed that this mouse tends to tilt a little bit depending on how I'm gripping it, because as you can see, the mouse feet are pretty small and not placed towards the sides at all. So here are the 3.5G graphs. This one shows what happens when you hit the malfunction speed, which is usually around 4 meters per second. And here are the 4G graphs. If you try to move the mouse as fast as you can to try to make it malfunction, the graphs end up looking really small and compressed like this, because there's one dot like way up high, which is some kind of error because I'm not moving my hand that fast. And these are what it looks like when you keep the speed under 4 meters per second. I was not able to make this one malfunction. You can see that this one's a little bit sparse on the left side. This is the one that I think might be showing what I'm feeling in game. The Abyssus 2013 has the same sensor, but what looks like a better shape and weight, if you don't mind only 3 buttons. The weight balance looks like too much in the rear though. Crate 2013 also has the same sensor, but also only 3 buttons. I was asked for comparison graphs of the 3.0, so here's what it looks like when you keep it under the 1.5 meter per second malfunction speed. Of course, due to the slow speed that I'm moving the mouse at, that's going to affect the graphs a little bit as well. And here's what it looks like when you try to make the mouse malfunction. This is probably around 3 to 4 ms. You can see that it just plateaus at 1.5, so you'll get what feels like negative acceleration in game, where you might be moving the mouse faster, but the cursor will only move a certain speed. This is actually one of the best kinds of malfunction that you can get, because instead of the sensor stopping response completely, it basically just limits the speed that you can move the cursor. As Mouse Tester becomes more known, I've been seeing people having mice that perform quite differently than someone else's, such as one person's FK1 performing much better than others. So there definitely seems to be some variance between mice of the same brand and model. Also, while it seems that tighter graphs in general show better performance, there are things the graphs don't show. For example, many people who had perfect looking FM graphs were still feeling the same skipping or micro freezes in game, and the 3366 and 4G sensor graphs look pretty similar, but the mice feel very different in game. Also, the G402, for example, has interpolated movement past a certain speed, so the graphs look great, but it may not feel like that in game.